Say, no, you're missing the point. Like here's this woman, like she gets it. She gets, this act of worship and really celebrates it and really reminds actually throughout, his statements that this is an act that's going to be remembered for all time. It's a significant act of what she did. But I share that, and in sharing that, it kind of leads to this question of why the gift? Why such an extravagant gift? Why such an extravagant act of generosity? And I think to understand that, again, we've got to go to kind of the parallel account in John chapter 12. See, Mark oftentimes in his retelling of Jesus' stories, he's kind of like the action movie director. Like when you read through the book of Mark, it's all the explosions and all the effects. But John's more the drama. Like John's more the storyline. He really gets into some of the details, and that's exactly what we see. And I think it's important. It gives us some insight into what I believe is a lot of the motivation behind Mary's act of generosity in this story. And we see it at John 12, verse 2 through 3. It says, "Here dinner was given in Jesus' honor, and Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and then she poured it on Jesus' feet." So again, the important part you got to get of that is again, who's in the crowd, who's sitting in the seats that day, and it points out specifically in John, Lazarus, and that's not a small little detail. That's pretty significant, especially when you consider that the chapter just before that was one of Jesus' most amazing miracles. It was a miracle where Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus is sick. He's reclining, not at a table, but he's reclining on his deathbed. It looks like it's over. It looks like it's done. And so they ask Jesus for help, and Jesus shows up. 4 days kind of late, like the funeral, like food is already, leftovers already been eaten and already gone. Here's Jesus showing up on the scene, and he goes on to do the most amazing miracle. He calls him to roll away the stone, asks Lazarus to come out. And it's just amazing, amazing, amazing move of God, amazing, miraculous work. All right, which leads us to this story. See, since then, this is the first time that Mary would have seen Jesus again since that miracle, since that moment. And so again, I think it kind of starts to paint a little bit of picture of the why, the generosity, the motive behind Mary's generosity. As you can just imagine her coming in, and here she is. She's seen all these guys kind of sitting back, eating their chicken wings, watching football. I don't know what they're doing, but they're just kind of sitting back. But she looks over, and of all the people she spots Lazarus. And you can just imagine the memories flooding back to her, remembering back to the moment of how she thought she'd lost him. Here's this brother, here's this person she loves so much. And now, rather than reclining on a deathbed, here he's reclining at a table. And you can just imagine the emotion just flooding her as she thinks back of what almost could have been, what could have happened if Jesus didn't show up on the scene. And yet, as she's seeing this, you can just see this wave of gratitude, of remembering where her life was at, remembering where her situation was at before Jesus showed up. And looking at Lazarus, see, the point is what Lazarus reveals to us is really the motive behind her generosity, the motive that should be behind always all of our generosity in relation to God, and that is this motive of gratitude. It was gratitude. When you're flooded with a divine gratitude, your natural response is generosity. Your natural response is worship. And listen, I share that because this is huge for us when it comes to the test of generosity, learning generosity, because for some of us, the struggle, why we struggle with generosity is because there's some things in relation to the motives of our generosity that we need to unlearn. We've learned some false motives that I think have distorted our perspective when it comes to generosity. One of those kind of false I think motives that you sometimes find within the church when it comes to this area of generosity is this false motive of I've got to give. I've got to give. It's that mindset that oftentimes developed if you ever grew up in scary church where it's like if you didn't give, didn't put something in the bucket like God was going to strike you down the moment you walked out the door. Like you were going to be cursed for the rest of your life. There's nothing you could ever do. It's over for you. Again, and listen, I want to really be clear on this because I think this is significant for some of us. Is that when it comes to giving, you got to understand something. It has no bearing whatsoever on God's love or heart for you. No bearing whatsoever. Whether you give or not, whether you're generous or not, it doesn't affect God's love for you. And certainly when we're talking eternal aspects, it has no bearing whatsoever. In fact, I put in my notes this way. The test of generosity is not for God. It's not like he tests us looking to pass or fail us. The test is for us. The test is for us. See, biblical generosity should never bring into question God's heart for us, but it should cause us to question and reflect on our heart for him, as we're going to come to discover here. And so the first one here is again, this kind of false motive of I've got to give. I've got to give. To somehow win God's approval or somehow win God's affection or heart for me. The second false motive is this tendency to think I give to get. I give to get. And this is sort of approaching generosity with sort of this method of manipulation. It's viewing God sort of like a genie in a bottle. Like if I give this, then I'm going to go home and I'm going to find a check in the mail for $10,000 to get me out of all my troubles. And look, let me be clear on this: is that there is some truth within this. The Bible is actually very clear that when you give, when you walk in generosity, there is blessing that accompanies that. In fact, in Malachi 3, God says, "Listen, test me in this area." And notice the testing; it's for us. It's not for him. He said, "Test me in this and see if I will not open up the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing in your life." There's a promise there. But listen, while that may be the promise that comes with generosity, that's not the purpose of generosity. While that may be the promise of generosity, it's not the purpose of generosity. The purpose of generosity is ultimately to expose, it's to reveal the true condition of our heart, which brings us to actually what should be the true motive of generosity when it comes to our giving, when it comes to our walk with God. And that's that biblical generosity, it should always begin with this motive of I get to give. I get to give. In fact, the Bible puts it this way, God loves a cheerful giver. A cheerful giver. You might ask, well, how do you get to be a cheerful giver? And again, it kind of comes back to this whole aspect of gratitude. It comes back to this whole attitude of gratitude, that you and I, we get to give in the light of God's goodness, in the light of his grace and mercy in our lives. I've shared this before, but in fact, my wife always hates when I say this, but it's so true, is that do you realize that you, when it comes to giving, when it comes to generosity, when it comes to tithes and offering, do you realize that you don't ever have to give? You do not ever have to give. Giving, it's not a law. It's not a law of God. Now, it's a principle. It's a principle that if you walk in it, of course, there's a promise of blessing within that principle. But you and I, you don't ever have to give. That said, though, while you and I don't ever have to give, you should always want to give. You don't ever have to give. And so we're like, man, I came to the right church. That's right, amen. Listen, you don't ever have to give, but you should want to give. You should want to give. And in fact, if there's a lack of want to, I would encourage you, especially challenge you tonight, to take some time and really pray to God, ask God, man, why am I lacking in the want to? Because when you look at generosity through the lens of gratitude, when you look at what he's giving, like when you realize all that he's done for you, the grace he's given you, the mercy he's shown you, the love he has for you, the miracles he's done for you, how can your natural response not be generosity? How can it not be this attitude of gratitude that leads to this act of worship, this act of generosity? In fact, that's what the tithe is all about. For some of you that are new to church and I don't even understand what does a tithe even mean? Well, the tithe literally means tenth, and so we talk about returning the tithe. It's returning 10% of our income back to God, and the key part in that is it's a returning. It's a returning. Like, we don't give the tithe, we return it. It's a generosity that, again, is rooted in gratitude. It's recognizing that, listen, I know that every good and perfect gift comes from above. It starts with him. And when you start in that attitude of gratitude, generosity just comes naturally. When you start with gratitude, that's our natural response is this generous lifestyle, this generous living. And so it begins, it ends with gratitude. That's the motive of generosity, which leads to the last thing. When it comes to this test of generosity, we've got the measure of generosity, the motive of generosity, and then we find the mirror of generosity. The mirror of generosity. See, generosity has a way of revealing our hearts, and specifically the direction of our hearts as to where they're going in relation to God like nothing else. Like we're not talking like a Marshall's mirror. And when I say Marshall's mirror, I love to shop at Marshall's. I can get really good deals on clothes. But Marshall's is funny. Like, you go in their dressing room, and like it doesn't matter. I don't know where it's the lighting or the tight mirror they have. I can put a shirt on in Marshall's, and it's like, man, it can be this little skin tight thing, and I'm like, man, I'm looking good. Like, this is great. But then I get home, and like I look at it in a real mirror, or like it's reflected like from my wife's perspective, and she's like your gut's hanging out. Like, why would you pick such a thing? Like, that's not the kind of mirror we're talking about. No, the mirror of generosity has a way of revealing the true condition and motives of our heart like nothing else can. And we see this in the story. It reveals Mary's motive, but it would also reveal the motives and the heart of somebody else in this story. And that's the heart of one known as Judas, one of the disciples known as Judas. And we, again, see this because, listen, just like we can have false motives when we give, and we can have them also when it comes to not giving as well. You know, like sometimes we got reasons not to give that aren't really reasons, they're actually excuses. And that's actually what we see in Judas's life. As he encounters sort of this mirror of generosity, it would actually reveal really the real condition of his heart as the story goes on, because he's looking in the light of sort of this, of Mary's amazing, extravagant act of generosity. Immediately, Judas he's kind of appalled. he looks at it and he's like, man, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. Which, by the way, generosity without gratitude, it never makes sense. You know, why I say gratitude has to always be the motive of generosity is you'll struggle with generosity to try to do it any other way. Because it never, outside of gratitude, the gratitude, the goodness of our God, it never makes sense. And that was the struggle for Judas. As again, Judas, he sees this, and for him, he's like, man, this doesn't make sense. Like God, we've got, because, Judas, you got to understand something about Judas. Judas was the bookkeeper. He was the finance guy. He held the money. He held the books. He held the bag of cash, for the ministry. And so he's looking at it. He's thinking of it through the lens of operations. And he's like, listen, hey, whoa, Jesus, hold on. Like we've got some needs. We got some needs in the ministry. We got some things we got to do. And he's got the Sarah McLachlan music playing in the background. He's got the PowerPoint of starving kids in Africa. And he's like, what about the poor? What about our projects? What about our good works? What are the things we got to get to? And in fact, we see this in John chapter 12. And of course, what's interesting is we're going to come to discover is while it sounds great, it sounds really good. Man, God, this money, it seems like it could be used for something better than just this extravagant generosity, this extravagant form of worship. The truth was it would come to reveal maybe a deeper motive and really an unhealthy motive in Judas's life. And we see this in John 12:6. It says, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. See, just as Mary's generosity would reveal a heart towards God, Judas's lack of generosity reveals a heart that was increasingly far from God. And here's why this matters. I don't know if you've ever read that story, maybe even just when you were just hearing it right there, and thought, kind of like what I thought when I was looking at it, it's like why would you ever put Judas in charge of the finances? Because it's not like Jesus didn't know that Judas had a tendency to, swipe a few extra dollars off the till, and he had to, struggle with this, and he wasn't a guy you could really trust with finances or trust with money. And when I was thinking about this, I was like, when you get down to it, it's kind of the same reason why he trusts any of us with what he's given us. Because listen, just like he entrusted Judas with a bag, of resources, a bag of finances, a bag of talents, a bag of gifts. Listen, God has entrusted you with the same thing. Each of us, we've got talents, we've got gifts, we got time, we got resources. And so it's easy to kind of look at this and kind of chest like, God, that doesn't make sense. Why would you trust a guy like Judas with something seemingly so significant as sort of the funding of the ministry there? And really, the only answer you can come down to is that, again, for Jesus, it was never about the money. It was never about the money. It was always about Judas's heart and the direction of where his heart was going in relation to God. See, the whole part of it, the whole reason that he brought about this test of generosity, again, the test of generosity wasn't for God. It was ultimately for Judas. It was for us. It was to try to redirect his heart and ultimately redirect the course of his life. And again, this is why I say generosity is such an incredible mirror into the depths of our heart, the condition of our heart, the direction of our heart. In fact, just some quick dating advice for any singles out there. Listen, you want to know and be able to tell if a guy if his heart is really into you, like if this relationship is really going somewhere. Hey, listen, a clue that it's not is if every time you guys go out, you're always paying. If every time you go out, like fine dining is McDonald's. Because nothing reveals the heart than what we're willing to invest in, or in some cases not invest in. And that's really what Jesus is kind of getting. That's this whole process is because something you got to understand about Judas and really understand about all of our lives is that, it's so easy kind of with Judas to sort of demonize him and think, oh man, I could never be like Judas. I mean, Judas who would go on to betray Jesus and walk away from Jesus. But you got to understand, listen, nobody was closer. Like Judas, like nobody here in this room could say they have as close a relationship with Jesus as Judas did. I mean, Judas was with him night and day. I mean, talk about a close relationship, and yet Judas would go on to ultimately sell Jesus out, ultimately betray him. But in saying that, it's not like Judas woke up one day and like that was like his plan. like he woke up, he's like, you know what, for the next 3 years, I'm going to infiltrate the disciples. I'm going to pretend like I'm for Jesus the whole time. And then at the very end, when I get my opportunity, I'm going to sell them out. No, it was small steps of compromise, small steps of sort of holding on to the bag of his time, holding on to the bag of the resources, holding on to stuff he was never meant to really hold on to and cling to. In fact, I put in my notes this way, is that the path to selling Jesus out, it always starts with selling Jesus short. It's these small, subtle compromises. It's the looking at the widow and going, man, why sacrifice so much? Why give like she gave? Or seeing Mary and pouring this perfume and be like, man, why pour so much perfume? Like there is such a thing as putting too much cologne on. I mean, like, come on, like why not save some of that and use it later? I mean, it's these small little things of why give so much of my time? Why give so much of my resources? Trying to kind of hold on to it. And listen, the danger with that is that when we get content living in that place, eventually the direction of our heart, it can't help but start to grow cold. It can't help but start to take us in a direction farther from the heart of God rather than closer. Because the closer we get to the heart of God, how you know your heart is really growing when it comes to your relationship with God is that at the end of the road, it's this commitment to choose to love the Lord your God with all your heart. In fact, that's what we see Luke 10:27. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, keeping with everything. And look, I know when you hear that, sometimes it's like, whoa. Like that seems unrealistic. Like everything. I'm far from that place. Especially in this area of generosity. Like whoa. Hey, look. The goal here is that in saying all that, this isn't so much about where you're at right now, but it's about taking an honest look into the mirror of generosity and looking and really asking yourself, what direction is my heart going in relation to in all? In relation to worshiping God with everything. What direction am I going in? Where am I moving? Am I moving closer? Do I find myself giving in a willingness to surrender and trust God with all? More and more, am I willing to trust Him with my finances? Am I willing to trust Him with my time? Am I willing to trust Him with my resources? Am I willing to trust Him with my gifts? Am I willing to trust that? Or am I holding on like Judas? Trying to kind of cling to things. And here's why this matters is because, listen, if you won't worship God with everything, at some point you won't worship Him with anything. If you won't worship God with everything, at some point you won't worship Him with anything. It's a slow, subtle, small step at a time. Again, Judas didn't just wake up betraying Jesus. It was a small little step. It was a small sense of, Jesus, maybe I'll trust you with my time, but I don't know if I'm not sure if I can surrender and open up this area when it comes to my finances.